Okay. Okay. Good morning. We're going to start here in a minute. If you top off your coffees and find a spot. I didn't tell Danielle that we kind of have a rolling start for these things where we're with 9:15 is a suggestion. I think we're rolling on the live stream as well. We'll let folks come in as they arrive. Welcome. Good to be here this morning. We're really thrilled to have Danielle Chapman among us. We've been anticipating, some of us on Thursdays have been reading her book and specifically anticipating having a conversation with Danielle. So a few folks from the Thursday reading group are here. Danielle's a writer of poetry and nonfiction. She's a lecturer at Yale in the English department, which is not just an impressive thing to say about something. It's also an extra point of connection for us, for Ardell and me. Danielle's husband, Chris, teaches up the hill at the divinity school at Yale, and our son, Alden, got to take classes from both of him when he was in school there. And I'm actually telling the truth when I say that Danielle was one of his favorite professors in all of his experience there. Class about reading poetry to write poetry, I think, isn't that the one Alden was in? So this combination of craft and careful reading. We brought Danielle to the Arkansas Literary Festival. Christchurch did. That was our first connection, and it's probably 2015 or 2016, right around in there, when her first book came out, which was a fabulous book of poems called Delinquent Palaces. She's got another book of poems coming out called Boxed Juice this fall, so watch for that. I know you'll want it after you get to know her a little bit. She's published in the New Yorker and the Atlantic and all those kind of places. A cool connection for us was that 2 chapters of Holler came out first in the Oxford American, which is, if you're from Little Rock, you're proud of the Oxford American, or if you're just somebody who loves stories from and about that wacky extraterrestrial place called the American South. The Oxford American is a fabulous publication. So I'm going to read you just a couple of lines before she comes up on one of her poems. One of the poems in Delinquent Palaces references the place we're going to hear about today in Fairfield, Tennessee. And it ends, "But afternoon still fools us into indolence. Nothing to do but wait for cocktail hour when cool air blows up from the river, June bugs gleam, weevils spool into dust holes, screen doors clap in frames, and names take their chairs among the stars." Reading Danielle's book really helped me come into a more truthful conversation with the constellation of my own history and forebears, so I hope that's the case for you. Danielle, come on. I will say we'll have time for some questions at the end, so as she reads and speaks with us, I hope you'll think of your questions.
Thank you so much, Scott, and thank you all for having me. I'm really happy to be here in particular, and I'm so glad Scott mentioned that history. When he asked me down for the Arkansas Literary Festival, it was a meaningful moment for me, and it's continued to be meaningful. I'm not sure how much everybody knows this, but I'm married to another poet, Christian Wyman, and as many people know, because his story is well known, he was diagnosed with lymphoma about a year after we were married. So that's been very much a part of our faith journey. We have 2 children who are 14 years old, but as the mom and the wife and the poet in that scenario, the other one of the poets, there's a lot to do. There's a lot of life that has to be taken care of, and so sometimes it takes somebody pulling you out for one reason or another and saying, attend to this other thing. And so for me, that trip down to Arkansas was the beginning of really attending to the story of my family and to reckoning with my relationship with the South and the inheritance that I'd come upon. And at the time, as Scott mentioned, I had a couple of essays about about my childhood summers that were spent in this very Faulknerian sort of farmhouse in Middle Tennessee, and they were eventually published in the Oxford American, and they grew into this book. And so I think just being here today, what that's making me think about is how that story also fits in to the story of my faith, the story of my life as a poet, and whereas my poetry in many ways is more explicitly about matters of faith, I think in a lot of ways it's more challenging and more problematic and thornier to contemplate the ways that God can speak to us through history, because sometimes it seems like that's the last place we're going to find God. So I feel like this is a wonderful coalescence of different threads that are challenging me toward that question. So I'm going to read a little bit from the book. It's called Holler, A Poet Among Patriots. And holler, as a lot of you all know, because you live in Tennessee, has a couple of meanings. And for us at this house in Tennessee, it described the kind of no man's land, like the bramble between the yard and the river. Anything could happen down there. And if you were playing croquet and you wanted to be really mean, you'd knock somebody else's ball into the holler, and maybe they'd never find it again. But of course, it also refers to the kind of primal scream that a lot of us have within us, especially when your stories have been buried or pushed down, or there's silences around them on some level. When they finally come out, there's a kind of holler there. I should say one other aspect of the book is that it's very much about the military. My father died when I was very young, and we moved in with my grandfather, who had been the commandant of the Marine Corps during Vietnam. So a lot of the characters in my book are Marines, and I think that there's maybe one more meaning of holler there, which is that kind of, hoo-ah thing, the camaraderie, the idea of a holler that's sort of maybe a holler in the name of America, but with some caveats from me. Okay, so I'm going to start out by reading just a little bit from the preface of the book, which kind of frames it, and I'm sorry, I lost my place there. In terms of where I am now, as Scott said, I teach at Yale, so I'm considering the South from a different vantage than I came from, and as we all know, this has been a pretty difficult and tense subject to contemplate. So I'm going to start just by a little bit from the preface, which talks about the idea of this book. I didn't want to write a memoir. I didn't want to tie my work or my life to the South of my childhood. I didn't want to trot out the old saws about courage and character impressed on me by my grandfather, the Marine Corps general. And I had no intention of peddling the fantastical, self-flattering tale of his Confederate grandfather and his best friend, the enslaved man who supposedly saved great-great-grandfather's life on the battlefield, then went to fight for the Union Army, then came back and saved the white family from ruin. Which didn't mean that I had no use for myths. I was a poet, after all. But during the decade that it took to write this book, I, like everyone else, was becoming first and foremost a partisan. My Keatsian negative capability was getting fried by my Yeatsian fury, which wanted to escalate every argument into an epic. The only problem was, when I sat down to write progressive prophecy, what came out was wind. Part of the problem was that I knew, in my rational mind, if not my amygdala, that the terror I felt, the short-circuiting of my American nervous system that occurred between 2016 and 2022 was driven by an assumption that was fundamentally false, that half the country, the other half, was inhuman. I knew this because I was perpetually reminded, usually at the worst possible times, that those people were my family. The ones who raised me and sacrificed for me and made it possible for me to grow up with the opportunity to disagree with them in print. These disagreements tortured me nevertheless, and I made more than one night comparison between my own people and the silent majority of the Weimar Republic. But in the end, it always felt unfair and sloppy to treat such complex characters so bluntly. It wasn't just my filial piety that stopped me, though, for my scruples extended, maybe even more ardently, to the crazies. Those unforgettable Southern characters from my childhood who, if they hadn't loved me with such grizzled fervor, I could easily have lumped in with that feller who brought his own crucifixion cross to the Capitol on January 6th. That wild day, riveted and appalled, it was the pain-scorched ones I couldn't look away from. The long-haired, bespectacled, blank ones who'd been staring into a screen so long they'd become specimens in jars, goggle-eyed and pickled. The PTSD cases in full tactical gear, the desert skulkers, the dieters on dust, the guns for souls who'd shot their own childhoods right in the face. For I knew them, and I knew that despite all their hollering, all their violence and delusion and wrath, they were suffering. In a way, this was the main thing that childhood had trained me for, to see through eyes that met mine with the chaos of pain, the singular point of light within them that begged to be known and loved. I feared going too far down this road, of course. I didn't want to tread anywhere near the both sidesism that Trump and his ilk had turned to their own purposes after Charlottesville. Yet, I'd also begun to realize that my work might not have been political work after all, but something even more hellish. For, as Gillian Rose writes in her masterpiece, Love's Work, to live, to love is to be failed, to forgive, to have failed, to be forgiven, forever and ever. Keep your mind in hell and despair not. I was coming to understand that the question to which I'd been called was ultimately a metaphysical one. How can heaven and hell exist cheek by jowl in a place, in a person, in a nation's history, and in oneself? I knew that no government would ever be able to answer this question, not even an ideal one, nor would any ideology make the human personalities of my memory stick to the page. As Rose says, there is no democracy in any love relation, only mercy. So I went ahead and wrote the people and places I came from, hoping that if I could forgive them for what they were, I might be forgiven in return. So the first chapter of this book, sorry, just get a drink. The first chapter of this book is actually about my father who was also a Marine. When I was very small, he died in a scuba diving accident in Okinawa where he was stationed, and my mother was actually in the water with him and almost died as well, and she credited her survival on the fact that while she was in the water, the Baptist hymns from her childhood came back to her and kept her afloat in the waves. And in the book, I write about how her story of this near-death experience in which we lost my father was, in a way, the first poem that I ever heard. Just this incredibly urgent tale of life or death, marked by the raw order of its words. And after this experience, my mother made a very unusual decision, which was that she decided to bring me back and go to live with my father's parents. As I mentioned, my father's father had been the commandant of the Marines, and so here we went back to Washington, D.C., where he lived, and we moved in with them. And so as a very small child, I was plunged into just kind of a very pungent stew of American politics, history, and ideology, and also Southernness, because of this house that my grandfather had inherited, which was in Middle Tennessee. It originally was a tavern at the edge of the western frontier, built in 1790. So a very memorable place. Not many repairs since 1790. You know, sometimes you fall through a floorboard. You know, you kind of never know what's going to happen. And that's true also when it comes to the people who are around. It was a place that in some ways had not modernized in terms of, you know, amenities or people's personalities and ideas. So I'm going to read, while I don't actually know anybody who was at the Capitol on January 26th. I'm going to read about, January 6th. Hopefully we don't have another one coming. But I'm going to read about two of the characters who lived around the house. They wouldn't have traveled to the Capitol because they actually never left the county in which they were born their whole lives. So I'm just going to read a little bit about two of them. James and Ella were, strictly speaking, Fairfield's caretakers, though the only time I ever heard them referred to that way was by Hortense Cooper, was by Hortense Cooper, widow of Prentice Cooper, the former governor of Tennessee. My grandparents had led Hortense, their fellow dignitary, to the place under the clothesline where we all sat with our fly swatters in the afternoons. The breeziest spot in the backyard, its only drawback was its proximity to John Audrey's pasture, which, besides the flies, offered an aromatic bouquet that Ella poetically described as 3 kinds of shit: cow shit, pig shit, and chicken shit. Hortense must have felt disoriented and really couldn't be blamed when she turned to the toothless woman slunk into an aqua tube top next to her and inquired, "Do y'all enjoy being caretakers here?" Forever afterward, Ella referred to Hortense as "that old heifer" and barricaded herself inside whenever she came to visit, which wasn't often. It's hard to overestimate the violence with which the current state of James and Ella's house, originally the kitchen to the big house, removed a few yards from it to prevent fires, now cocooned in poison ivy vines and used as a fishing shed by people who'd never dream of actually living there, would make Ella turn in her grave. Ella didn't just live in that place. She inhabited it with the passion of a voodoo priestess, particularly after James died. 2 decades after her death, the walls still leach her high-octane nicotine, but the rooms of buckled paneling and uneven linoleum, always lit up like a blister when she was in them, have dried to timber, revealing their meanness. Without her things, photos of her great-great-nieces and nephews, the little blue-eyed devils Ella adored with the same vehemence she hated almost everything else, her unlikely collection of befrocked porcelain-faced dolls that covered the bed where she and James had slept before she moved to the velour recliner, the TV's permanent glow. Without Ella in it, the house appears a shameful place in which to keep somebody. James and Ella were what Papa called the salt of the earth, a phrase that was intended to spin their less attractive qualities as virtues and explain or justify our relation to them. They'd lived in the small house for 40 years or so. Great-granddad, Papa's father, had recruited them as both help and company after the death of his wife, Claire. Before they met great-granddad, James and Ella had been living in the bona fide shack that floated on a mud skid among the cattle troughs to the left of our property, where John Audrey, the farmer next door, boarded his field hands. In my time, only the most down-and-out, pot-bellied, dirt-faced Calibans had lived there, and it was impossible to imagine James and Ella in such circumstances, for they were almost like members of the family. Almost. When the weather was warm enough, they lived in the side bedroom of a big house, which had no insulation, moving to the small house when they needed heat or when we got to town each June. Then, at some point, they moved over there permanently, leaving behind only their deep freeze, which they kept stocked with walleye, cigarette cartons, and other provisions that we were meant to keep our hands off. They'd met at the country fair, when James was working Old Man Farrell's farm and Ella was a cook at the Fairfield schoolhouse. He'd walked past her carrying a brown bagged bottle and slurred, "Foller me, chicken, I'm full of corn." "I've been follering him ever since," she'd conclude when telling this story as if it were her life's only piece of luck. Their romance had occurred in an inconceivable past where they rented cabins on a lake and caught the ferocious fanged fish that were mounted on boards above their couch, a time presumably before Ella's skin had withered into one concentric wrinkle and she spent her days arthritically locked into a lawn chair, sucking down Winston's, drinking sweet tea made with sulfur water, and chewing her cud. Even in this state, Ella vowed to wring the neck of any hussy who looked sideways at James, and was convinced that plenty did, maybe because of the bumper sticker on his pickup that read, "I break for blondes, brunettes, and redheads." In belted work pants, a crush cap, and mesh shoes, with his long filed fingernails pincered around a butt end, James was debonair in a way that no one could explain or deny, despite the fact that he was almost as awful looking as Ella. All of us, even Nana, were smitten with him, for he possessed that talent for mischief that's often irresistible to protected women. A staunch Marine Corps-style standard of safety and security ruled all of Papa's affairs, and therefore ours. James, on the other hand, liked things a little bit evil. My mornings were consumed by trying to make him laugh, nuzzling his grizzle stash, smashing my face into his collar's red root-cratered triangle, grappling his chin open to confirm the 6 count of his teeth until he hippo-chomped me without so much as smirking. I always wanted him on my team when we played croquet, for he was ruthless and wouldn't hesitate to one-handedly thwack his opponent's ball into the rotted meal of a tree stump or the riverbank's marshy holler, laughing like Jehoshaphat once he'd inflicted the damage, even if his opponent was only 7 years old. Thank you. That's what... Okay.
All right, we'll talk for a minute, but I want y'all to be thinking of your questions for Danielle. Even just after the vivid little snippet she gave you from the book. Let me see if this is on. I think that's on. Okay, see if it's on.
Is it on?
Is that good?
Sound good? Can you hear me?
Oh, I don't know where to start after even just that much. But the one bigger picture thing that occurs to me since you started with the introduction and you kind of admitted that this was going to be a difficult, complex project. I love in that description you just read of James and Ella and how much affection is in there, even amid all of the hilarity. Mm-hmm. And back when I was in college, I had an English prof named Shirley Thomas who was a piece of work. She was fabulous Southerner. And she said, be careful as you learn to write because you'll be able to hurt people. You'll be good with words and you'll be able to hurt people with those words. I experienced this whole book with this great affection and gentleness, even as you spared nothing in painting the pictures. Is that a tension? How did you navigate that tension? Does that question make sense? There's a tension in using all of yourself to describe and yet knowing, I don't want people to hate these people. I don't want them to laugh even. I want them to laugh but not at them. Yeah. How did you navigate that?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I definitely know what you mean. One of my favorite writers is Flannery O'Connor. But, Flannery O'Connor's mean.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think I learned to write from her to some degree, and I learned to love those grotesques she creates. And she's merciless with them, and she has a point, and her point, in a way, is, really, she was a faithful Catholic, and her point often is a religious one, and yet, once I started writing these characters, that attitude felt wrong to me. I felt like I couldn't finish the book until I could find a way to represent love. Love in the face of, all of the forces that conspire against it, including the personalities of the people themselves, and my own personality. I think there's kind of two levels to it, because one thing is just simply the ironic distance that you kind of have to cultivate in order to be able to write. So there's that, but then there's also the fact that coming to consciousness, and as I talked about in the preface, coming to consciousness as a Northern liberal who teaches at Yale, there's also an aspect of it where you see parts of people that are not acceptable. And I didn't read from this, but what happens later in the James and Ella section is that, as an adolescent, I simply could no longer tolerate Ella's racism, which was florid. It was outrageous by our standards, and unceasing, and and I essentially stopped going to visit her, and I simply couldn't tolerate it, and it presented a moral dilemma, and so I think she's one example, but the book in general is an attempt to try to understand the fact that love and, I guess maybe it's not too strong a word to say evil, can exist at the same time.
Yeah. There's something biblical about all that. Not in the love everybody, but in the characters themselves. Mm-hmm. I found when I was reading it, and maybe I've thought this a little bit, but poignantly about Southern literature, and I think Flannery O'Connor says it someplace, in the South, we write about freaks because we still know how to recognize one. But also there's a sense of wholeness. There's a sense of wholeness that she said, if we see how we're broken, that there's... Anyway, I wonder if writing about these people, affected how you read those weird old Bible stories? Was that already in you to say, I've got some chops for this because I've already struggled with the people of Abraham in some of those wackinesses, and I think there might be some grace in there, or did it go back the other way? Have you thought about that at all?
Well, that there is, in the South, Cormac McCarthy's another one. It seems that it is populated by a lot of Old Testament characters. It's interesting. I just the other day I found myself writing a poem about Jonah, and I thought, I understand this guy now. I think maybe the part of it is, the sort of the term that's coming to mind is like the black and white quality of their worldviews. Mm-hmm. And the fact that grace, if it's going to penetrate, has to kind of knock them upside the head. It's going to be something that is, very unexpected and dramatic. And I think that's something that I kept finding myself surprised to encounter in my family history, was just really how extreme people's lives were, and how much trauma there was, how much suffering, and how little facility they had for, or not just facility, but how little opportunity they had to alchemize it and incorporate it and make sense of it. And I think that's a little bit of a Old Testament way of living on some level.
Yeah. And I hadn't thought about this until you were just reading about James and Ella, and that everybody was smitten with James. There is a back and forth between Eros. Your parents were very deeply in love. Your mother was clearly your father was a beautiful person. Your Nana wasn't it Johnson had a crush, maybe had a crush on her, like your grandfather wondered if. Yeah. And then James and Ella. So the fact that your grandfather was a Marine is order and rational and that way of understanding the world. Mm-hmm. Eros has its own rules. Is that a piece of this back and forth? The book very much seems like it goes back and forth between the rigor of the Marine and the Marine in his house that's falling down.
Right.
Nothing like the barracks that he oversees.
I might need a couch to lay down on.
Okay. Well, I'll bring Ardell up then if that's where we're going.
Yeah, that I think is definitely one of the huge silences in this book, is the fact that, I think I usually think of it in terms of simply the absence of my father, but the truth is it was an erotic absence. He was a Marine. He was a very handsome man, and he looked a lot like my grandfather. And here we move back in with my grandfather, and we formed this family, and there was nothing untoward going on other than the fact that we were somehow held in this magnetic bond that nobody ever talked about or explained. And my grandmother, what Scott was referring to was my grandfather sometimes said that he credited his success in the military to my grandmother, who was a good-looking, dark-haired Southern lady, which was just the kind that Lyndon B. Johnson really liked. And there are pictures of Johnson and my grandmother shaking hands. There's one that's quite incredible because, he had that really furrowed brow. I think of it kind of like a Sharpei, and he's just looking at her, and she's gleaming up at him with her kind of like, whenever there was a flash bulb, she could see it from a mile away. And she was a real Southerner too. And if she were to have met you, she would have said, "Well, hello, I'm very pleased to meet you. My name is Emily Donaldson Walton Ford Chapman Jr., descendant of the Huguenots who founded Nashville." So, she she kind of has her own.
That's fabulous.
Yeah.
I don't know if I want you to read the end. Well, you mentioned forgiveness in the beginning, and I think maybe the last word in the book, or the last sentence, was about forgiveness. Can you say something about how some desire for forgiveness, or how you were using that word as you re-engaged these stories?
Yeah, well, the final chapter of this book, and I'm going to be talking about this a little later today because I'm preaching at the next service and talk about this pretty explicitly. But through all these extraordinary characters, nothing really compares to what happened at the end of my childhood when I was about 21 years old. Descendants of people who had been enslaved by my ancestors contacted my grandfather and invited him to their family reunion. And the next year, he invited them over to the house at Fairfield. And as it turned out, the black and white families had both inherited the same story, which was a story of a very close friendship between my great-great-grandfather and their great-great-grandfather, who were the same age and had grown up together, even though George, who was black, had been born into slavery. He eventually saved my ancestor's life at the Battle of Stones River, and then went to fight for the Union Army, but later returned, and the friendship lasted till the end of their lives. So, this amid a lot of other stories that aren't as happy. However, this story had been very important to George's descendants, and my grandfather had told me this story when I was a small child. So at that point, it was when I was about 21. Reunions started happening at the house, and they've happened ever since. And so our family is very small now. I'm the last child. I'm an only grandchild. I have no cousins on either side of the family. But now when we go down to Tennessee, we get together with about 100 people, a lot of whom call me Cuz. And essentially we've been taken into their family. And there is quite a story of forgiveness there, which includes me being baptized by them, which I'll talk about a little bit later today.
Wow.
It's quite explicit. It's extraordinary and it's explicit. And it's all in the name of relationship and, in the name of faith. It's part of their faith to offer this forgiveness and to forge a relationship. So it's pretty unusual, and it's supernatural, I'd say.
Yeah, that story is fabulous. I didn't know how much explicitly to go into that of the two families, but an interesting dynamic within it, too, was the way that part of your struggle was knowing it's important to distrust the narratives that have been handed down to us. Mm-hmm. We need to... Who benefited from this lovely story about an enslaved person saving a family twice? Mm-hmm. But later, when the two families got together, often it were descendants on the black side of this family reunion who said, actually, this story is important to us in this way. Mm-hmm. It was powerful to have unexpected people be pulling people in unexpected directions to unfold the story. So I don't know if there's a question in there, except did you learn something in that process about how history gets told and how it gets remembered and which voices ought to be, how do we tease out the lessons we ought to be taking from a story? Is that a question? Kind of?
Yeah. Well, I think basically this story, its role in my life, has been to drastically humble me. And to show me, first of all, that my story is something that's part of something much larger. But also, you can have your pride in your point of view can exist regardless of what point of view that might be.
Yeah.
And so, in this kind of ironic way, my race consciousness, my understanding of, the sins of my ancestors put up a barrier to relationship with the descendants of people that my family had enslaved, because I didn't want to be implicated in everything that stood for. And so a lot of, it's been a long process of realizing how much humility is required in order to have relationship. And so in terms of history, I think the takeaway for me is just that history is extraordinarily complicated, and we have to be, basically, and if we can be honest about it, there might be some little glimmers of grace and hope and connection in places that we don't expect it.
Yeah. I'd love for y'all to have 10 or 15 here.
I don't mind starting. Christine, I love that you wrote the story down at all in 10 years, wrestling with the questions. Very, very often on Tuesday nights, we'll watch Finding Your Roots with Skip Gates. And I don't know if you all see it, but there will be a couple of people, and he will use DNA and genealogical records to tell various film stars or athletes or whoever the two celebrities du jour are. And hardly anyone can even name their great-grandparents on either side. And they will have maybe the nugget of a story. They will be like, well, it was always said that maybe Jim wasn't really Bertha's natural child, right? Or something, there's always some kind of intrigue. But I think and you touched on it, I think it's somewhere between page 70 and 80. What's insidious about these Southerners is that they make you love them, and they do things for you, and then about the age of reason dawns on you, and you're like, hey, these people are incredibly racist, right? But then we don't, at 13, 14, we don't have the ego strength and the language to say, hey, you can't say that anymore. Mimi, you really shouldn't be saying Nigra in the 70s, right? That's not cool anymore. At least I didn't. I didn't have. And how did you? But I think distance and cutoff, as happened with Ella, is kind of the natural response to that. And unless you have the courage to revisit it later, I think that's how families drift apart, right? Over the stuff that isn't spoken and dealt with. So so there's no question. I'm glad you did it. That's all.
So what if Ella had lived longer? So I'm asking, my question for you that you would have asked maybe is, if Ella had lived longer and you had had an opportunity as an adult to re-encounter her, how that might have been different.
Well, there's also this unbelievable practical issue there, because the reunions didn't start the reunions with the Singleton and McMahon descendants didn't start until after Ella died. And I wonder if on some level my grandfather didn't allow them to happen until then, because, you know, what does it mean to welcome this large black family into a place? And, you know, probably Ella wouldn't have come out of her house, but what, you know, what situation are you creating there? And so, yeah, in practical terms, it would have been a real dilemma to figure out how to have a relationship with Ella at this point. However, something that's so interesting that happened is that one of the McMahon descendants, her name is Cheryl, and she worked at a nursing home. And, you know, I remember, you know, spending all this time at reunions and stuff, you know, I just kind of felt embarrassed about Ella, like I wouldn't ever bring her up, or, you know, it's like, let's just, you know, the Singletons used that house as their fishing shed. You know, they, you know, put the grills in there and stuff. And one day I learned that she had taken care of Ella in the nursing home. And she said, I loved that lady. She, you know, and she said, and she loved me. And I just thought, can this be true? What, you know, like, what is it that I don't know? But also, the thing is that the only way that the relationships can exist with the McMahon and Singleton descendants is if I can allow these other people to exist too, because, you know, they're all there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
When you started the talk today, you said you weren't sure whether you were going to write this memoir or why you were writing it. And last week we had a speaker, one of our own, Elizabeth Jemison, who it taught me the words critical empathy. And I was thinking about that this week as I was reading the book, and how you have broadened my thoughts about critical empathy by reflecting on the history and on your history, but in some ways it echoed what my history would be and how to deal with the shame of the white shame, the other side, and how to deal with that. But I thought it was really lovely how you did that. But it took you 6-8 years to write the book, and you didn't write the book for publishing and royalties. You didn't write the book for tenure. You wrote the book because it was something yearning, probably a catharsis. The question I better get to quickly is, what was the real learning when you finished? What did you surprise yourself with in terms of writing a book like this?
That's a great question. One thing I surprised myself with was that I finished it because it was just there. I mean, and there's about 10,000 pages that are still like a kind of quagmire in my attic somewhere. So, yeah, you know, I think that, well, it surprised me. I mean, it did surprise me the form that it finally took, partly because I had to give myself permission to make it a memoir, that is, to make it a book that's about my life. The story that's about the Singletons that's currently chapter 5 is such an extraordinary story. And as I mentioned, you know, something that's just begun. At the moment, MTSU, their Center for Historic Preservation, is working on the story. They've done all this research around the house and working with some descendants on restoring black cemeteries, uncovering all sorts of other stories. So, you know, this is so much bigger than I am, and yet I'm the writer. And so for many years, I just felt this huge responsibility, like I have this story to tell about that comes out of slavery, and yet I'm so implicated in it. And I'm not a journalist, I'm a poet. And so, you know, I just was very hamstrung for a long time. And I had to finally allow myself to say, okay, that is many stories that need to be told, but it's still okay for me to make this my memoir. And then I think the one other thing is, or one thing that compelled me, and part of the hunger of writing the book, I think, was just to be with these people again. When I'm as I said, I'm an only child and only grandchild, so many of the people who I grew up with and loved have passed. And I think a writer's, compulsion is often really to bring back the dead. And so I was pleased that, in some places it seems like some of their living energy made it back.
Wow. Probably one more. Oh, I told you guys are going to have lunch.
You just said there are lots of stories to be told, and I know that in this room there aren't many of us that are young. We have stories. I know there are books out there called grandparent interview things. My daddy was born in 32. We had him. There are prompts on every page, when you were young, blah, blah, blah. There are prompts, questions that you are to write. And what a gift that is to his now great-grandchildren. So those of us who aren't poets, aren't writers, aren't smooth like her, we need to go buy those books, write in those books, because there are stories to be told. No question.
Okay, just y'all go write your memoirs. We're going to get ready to go to church. Let me ask you, would it spoil things for you to read just like this short passage about the otters?
No, not at all.
Okay. I'd love you to read this little bit at the end, and then we'll, it crystallizes some things for me, and then we'll go on to church. And Danielle did bring a few of the books with her. I thought Katie was going to be out there selling books out there, which, as I said, throw some books in your bag if you want. We'll figure out how to get it if you want a copy of it.
So starting like there.
Yeah, start where it makes sense.
So this is at the very end of the book, and it's taking place after one of the reunions that I just mentioned between the black and white Singleton descendants. After everyone had left, another hard afternoon rain came through, followed by a lemony late evening sun. I walked down to the river in that calm, wondering how I could possibly contain it all. The greens and browns and creams unloosed, the light, mild and various as melons. How would I ever explain why we baked Elwood McMahon 3 blackberry cobblers from berries picked that morning? How the canes ached with all that glowering a good soak in sugar water would have sweetened, as Fred Davis pointed out. My footprints sank in the wet violets humped beneath the wheel ruts everyone had driven over to get there. I heard the river gushing through the holler, and I remembered that, as a girl, I wasn't allowed to go down to the water alone. The storm now made the danger of it plain. Mud gushed between banks, sloshing torrents, and the heron who usually stands on the gravel bar glided above, searching for higher ground. I stood there, surveying the tumult. The risk of this place, of loving it, of owning it, had never been clearer. Then, out of the river's rush, I heard a chirp, raspy, loud, an unfamiliar bird gnawing into the air, half warble and half bark. I couldn't imagine what it was. The sound was entirely new to me, and it repeated insistently. I looked down and onto the bleached out fork of a caught tree trunk that stuck out of the rocks for 20 years, a creature nosed up. A snapping turtle or snake, I assumed. But no, Now the whole oil can head appeared, then hand-like paws, grasping, then the body, a foot of pelt and sinew intermingled, an otter. I stared. I'd never seen an otter in Fairfield, nor heard that anybody had. He stiffened his neck and barked, a hoarse and woeful plea. He was so close to me, I could see the valves of his nostrils dilate. Then he barked again, and they emerged on the opposite bank, 5 more otters. They wriggled out into the water, swiftly muscling against the boils to reach his call, bounding to our side of the river. And when they were close, he aimed himself into the current and leapt, so that one by one they crashed into him and clutched. In that instant, they made of themselves a raft, and without hesitation, the first otter began guiding them downstream, dodging the branches that had been dashed down by the storm. They held on to him and to each other, slick backs writhing, riding the flood together, and disappeared around the bend.
Thank you, Danielle. We'll probably have to go get ready for church, but we'll have some books afterwards. There are so many impossible appearances of grace like that in the book in all the wrong places. So go get it and read it. Thanks so much.